Lewis is in the studio with me, Lewis Goodall. I was listening to that. Interesting what he said there about opening a door for regime change and for the people of Iran to get stuck in, essentially, when the time is right. I mean, we're a long way away from that, aren't we?
I think we are.
What's going on overhead.
I think we're a very long way away from that, Shelagh. I mean, we should remember that Donald Trump said that what happened in Venezuela is the model. That was perfect in his point of view, and perhaps unsurprising, given that there were no American servicemen and women who lost their lives. It generated a great deal of publicity. There may be some long-term commercial interest. I can see why he might consider it the model. But it's worth noting, of course, that if that is the model, that's rather at variance with what Trump said on day one of this conflict, because he said, initially at least, that what this was about in Iran was a form of regime change. He called on the Iranians to rise up. That isn't what happened in Venezuela. There was continuity of the regime in Venezuela. It was simply that one of the heads of the Hydra was taken off and another took its place.
And a more supine one.
And it looks like that's going to be the case again now. Now, I note today that Israel has made clear, and I think this is, you can understand why, it's one of the many reasons I suspect Keir Starmer had some hesitation about this entire enterprise. The Israeli government have said today that whosoever the Iranians choose to replace the late Ayatollah will be killed as well. Now, where does that get us? That's a sort of conveyor belt of endless assassination of Iranian leaders. Now, none of whom, I'm sure, what I know, are pleasant people, and many of them, including the late Ayatollah, have done appalling things. But I'm not exactly sure that constitutes much of a mission or set of objectives, and certainly one that the rest of the world can understand, let alone subscribe to.
It doesn't necessarily make us, or indeed our world leaders, any safer, does it?
It doesn't. And I have to say, Sheila, I have been quite struck by the fact that there have been quite so many in the British media, particularly on the right, but not exclusively, and so many in politics as well, who clearly, I think, pay lip service to the idea of learning the lessons of the Iraq War, but clearly have learnt none of the lessons of the Iraq War. The echoes of 2002 and 2003 over this last 72 hours, I think,
get louder and louder.
Get louder and louder and louder. Except it's worse than that. Because at least in 2002 and 2003, there had been 18 months of discussion and analysis and diagnosis and proposed prescription from the United States administration under George W. Bush at that time. The aims of that were clearer. They weren't always completely clear, but they were clearer. And there had been a political process, both at the United Nations, although that was aborted, and indeed within the United States and the UK itself. None of that has happened this time. Instead, we have seen a spasm from Israel and from the United States. And I think when we heard, Keir Starmer, who isn't always as clear as he might be, was very clear on the floor of the House of Commons today when he basically said that as far as he was concerned on Saturday, he could see neither the legal basis for this, nor he could see what the objective was. And if he couldn't see those two things, then he didn't want to apply and use British forces to contribute towards it in that offensive capacity, which I think is clear. And then secondarily, I'd say this. There's been a lot of talk about the special relationship over the last 24 hours, and Donald Trump and, a lot of newspapers declaring almost with glee that Keir Starmer has destroyed the special relationship. Two things I'd say to that. Number one, if anyone has helped diminish, let's put it that way, the special relationship, if it exists at all, you could say it's Donald Trump. Remember, it was only a month or so ago that he was suggesting that our brave servicemen and women in Afghanistan hadn't done very much in the 20-year war there.
Europe's over.
But indeed,
NATO's over.
We're going to take Greenland, etc. You could read out the list. But secondarily as well, if there is any country, if this whole episode reminds us of anything, if there is any country that has a special relationship with the United States, it's not us, it's Israel. And there is a very, very strong, there's been a suggestion, not least from the Secretary of State himself, Marco Rubio, that one of the reasons this is happening now, rather than in the future, or whenever it would happen to be, is because Israel was going to do it anyway, and the United States felt that it had to get along with that or go along with that, otherwise it was going to be attacked. That is
something Trump denied, didn't he, in the Oval Office yesterday? He said, no, if anything, I pressed Bibi on
Well,
this.
he would say that, wouldn't he? And, that if that is the case, and it isn't, the sort of fringes of conspiracy theory suggesting it is the Secretary of State himself, then that is the Israeli tail wagging the American dog. And let's remember, Benjamin Netanyahu has wanted to do this since the late 1990s. He has been warning about an Iranian nuclear missile being just around the corner since the late 1990s. Now, given that if that were true, we would assume that Tel Aviv would have been bombed to bits years ago. So we shouldn't necessarily sort of outsource our military assessments to Benjamin Netanyahu on this. But the point is this, is that he has wanted American presidents to do this, Democrat and Republican, and they've all said no. It seems to be that he has a unique ability to make Donald Trump do what he wants him to do. And I can understand
They're similar
in that.
men, aren't they?
They are. And I can understand that is yet another reason that I can understand why Keir Starmer might have been a touch sceptical about the entire enterprise.
Let me ask you for your thoughts on this, and it's something that, oddly enough, concerns me more than the nuclear question, because the nuclear question, obviously, it can feel very remote. I mean, none of us wants it to ever come about, but it can feel very remote. But what doesn't feel remote to me is the violent Islamism that at times has swept various parts of the world, not least in our own country as well, in certain terrorist attacks. There was a question, and I'm not suggesting the response to that is to do what's happening in Iran, but I do question whether we are, as a nation, alive enough to that threat. The question in PMQs today from Ed Davey about the IRGC.
Yes.
For people who, we say it a lot, for people who don't know what it's called, what it stands for, it's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Thank you. A question about whether we should make it illegal in this country. There have been questions about the Muslim Brotherhood as well. Keir Starmer seemed to be saying we're looking at it, and others, state-backed terrorism. But is there an argument that we are a bit limp about that?
Look, I mean, people have wanted to prescribe the RGC for a long time. There have always been, different governments have said that there are sort of political and legal problems with it. Other countries have done it, and there are people in the UK think that we should. And I think that's a perfectly valid and legitimate discussion, and maybe it's one that Keir Starmer will return to. I suppose, though, I mean, and we should say, caveat this or put context in this by saying the British government, this one and previous ones as well, have been completely clear that Iran, we know they are a state sponsor of terrorism. That includes the UK. This regime is not our friend. It is not a friend of any regime in the West, and then it includes, of course, Muslims living in the West who could absolutely be killed just like anybody else by their state-sponsored activity.
Islamism has killed more Muslims
indeed
than
I mean, I suppose what I would say is, of course, is that some people and some analysts would suggest that, of course, the perception of Western militarism in countries like Iran can itself fuel exactly the sort of Islamism that we want to stop, because it allows these bad actors to portray the West as a sort of marauding force wanting to destroy
But it
Muslims.
predates that.
Of course it does, but it adds to that sense. I mean, we saw that in the wake of Iraq. We saw it in the wake of...
It gives cover to it.
It gives it cover, it fuels it. It doesn't justify anything, of course it doesn't. But it provides an extra pretext, an extra rhetorical flourish for them. So I think, as always with these things, we have to... that is why these things have to be very carefully calibrated. And I think we have to say that I don't get much sense that is happening from the White House at the moment.